Welcome to the Changes to the CANS webinar. This is our second webinar that we are presenting on the upcoming changes that go into effect this Sunday, February 22nd, 2015. My name is Deborah McDonough. I'm a program manager for the CANS training program at EOHS. Also with us today is Jack Simons, who's the Assistant Director at EOHS for CBHI. So welcome and thank you for listening today. Our presentation will go about 40-45 minutes, and from there we'll open it up to questions and answers. We can do questions and answers up till 1:30 today. Here's a few housekeeping items for you to review. As you can see, it says audio is provided through your phone line. Call into 774-220-1199 to join. We'll use the mute feature on this conference call. The webinar is being recorded and we hope to have it posted next week. You'll get an email from CBHI connecting you to the link on the CANS training program and also on the CBHI website. For today, we're asking for best result to choose one mode of audio, either through your computer speakers or the phone, but not both. Also, I'd like to just acknowledge that I have a voice that can be scratchy at times. I hope you can understand me. Excuse me for the cough. I'll do my best to speak as clearly as possible. And thanks for your patience as you listen to me. As we said, there'll be a Q&A section at the end of the presentation, and we'll instruct you when you are able to ask a question. So let's start with our content, changes to the CANS. Why are these changes being made? They're made because for a long period of time, we've heard from providers that this would really make a difference for them in terms of working with families, particularly with in instances where there are multiple providers caring for the same child. It also is in fitting with CBHI's approach to collaborative care, that you be able to share and communicate information. And so this is a long requested option to share the CANS across providers at all levels of care. The other change that is going on is related to the diagnosis section in the CANS. Due to the recent changes to DSM in the ICD, there are changes reflected also in the CANS, which is basically we are dropping the Axis 1 and 2 items in the CANS, on the CANS, and we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. So the new consent process. It allows and permits a provider to enter the CANS in the virtual gateway and then share the CANS across all other providers for whom the caregiver has given consent. It also, as I mentioned, supports the CBHI family-driven, community-based collaborative model of care. So how will this work? Well, it will start on Sunday the 22nd. All prior consents will expire. That means that all providers must obtain new consent from the caregiver before they enter a new or revised CANS for the child. In many cases, that will be the next time you see the family. An important thing to note is that in cases where the caregiver declines consent, the procedure for setting consent to no on the virtual gateway is unchanged. So more about this. The new consent form explains to the caregiver that by signing the consent form, they are giving permission to a provider to enter the CANS on the virtual gateway, sending the information to EOHS and the MCE paying for the service. and also for the state to share the CANs on the VG with any other provider to whom the caregiver has given current consent. So this exchange of CANs is only for providers caring for the same child who both have consent. What are the benefits of this new process? Well, as we said, it allows all providers caring for the same child to have a clear and current picture of what is happening in the child and family's life. And it's particularly important when a child is cared for by multiple providers or requires treatment in multiple levels of care. This helps to build collaboration by ensuring that everyone is on the same page while saving time for both the providers and the families. It does so as the families will not have to repeat their whole story. And as you may know, this is something that we have chronically heard from families is a source of frustration for them. Providers will have immediate access to current information that affects the child's care. That's an important benefit for the provider. The provider can view, copy, and edit in existing CANs, which will save them time and effort. So what's different? Well, the language in the new consent form is more user-friendly. We try to make it easier as a breakdown for the family to understand when they read it or when the provider talks to them about it. We can say that it is still available in 8 languages. New consent permits all providers with active consent who care for the same child to have a clear and timely picture of what is happening in the child and family's life. When a new provider enters the CAN for the first time, the new provider will automatically see a list of the previous CANs completed by other providers who also have current consent. So when you go into that screen, you're going to see those previous CANs. So what's unchanged? Actually, quite a bit is unchanged and remains the same. But let's go through those so people understand that. The first is the faxing process is the same. The process for managing consent in the application is the same. The provider must still enter the SCD section on the VG and complete the CANs on paper and enter the CANs into the child's medical record if consent is no. The consent will expire after the same time specified on the consent form. Generally, that's 12 months. It's a default set to 12 months, but you may determine in your conversations with families that the consent will be for a short period of time. Here are more things that remain unchanged. The provider gives the consent form to the caregiver, the legal guardian in this case, and explains the process. The provider can still print the consent forms in advance. We actually recommend that you have them on hand and available for you, and that you make sure that you switch off and discontinue using the old forms. The provider will still click to find consent forms from within the CBHI application or from the CAN's website, so that's unchanged. In addition, the person given permission for consent signs and dates the consent form. The provider is now authorized to enter CANs into the VG, which is the CANs application on the virtual gateway. The provider selects the Manage Consent tab and clicks the Manage Consent sub-tab, and then enters the member's Mass Health ID number. The provider selects the Yes button, then enters the relationship of the caregiver to the member. The start date for the consent will default to present day, and the end date will default to 1 year from present day. But again, as I stated earlier, the provider can choose other dates at the direction of the caregiver. Then the provider clicks OK, and then OK again, to print the pre-populated consent information sheet, which basically is the fax cover sheet. And it must be used as the CANS fax cover sheet. The reason for that is that when you fax it in and you don't use that, the system doesn't recognize the cover sheet and it basically rejects it. So it's critical that you not, for example, use the cover sheet of your provider organization. You must use the pre-populated consent information sheet as the CANS fax cover sheet. Then you take the you fax the sheet with the signed consent form to Mass Health at 617-887-8700. We did have a question at the last webinar about that number being available, and we've tested it repeatedly, and we find that it is working properly. Next steps is that the provider logs into the VG and selects the Manage Consent tab. The provider enters the Mass Health ID for the member and documents that caregiver declines consent. Provider notes this in the medical record. So basically, if a family says no, and that's their prerogative, you just go in and you document and select no, and then you can put a note in the medical record that the family declined consent. You do not fax or send any notice of declined consent to Mass Health. The procedure stops at the application. At that point, the provider must still complete the demographic section and the SED section in the CBHI CANS application on the VG, and then you finalize the CANS as documented on paper. You complete the CANS on paper and enter it into the child's medical file. There is one procedural change related to a situation where a caregiver cancels consent. There's only one procedural change, so I'll start with what's the same, what's unchanged. The provider goes on to the CANS application on the VG and changes the status from yes to no in the Manage Consent tab. Going forward, the CANS system will only permit the provider to enter demographic and SED information for the member. The member must enter this information and finalize the CANS as documented on paper, and the CANS must be done on paper and included in the child's medical record. Here's the change. If a family decides or a caregiver decides to cancel consent, the provider must notify Mass Health. And you do this by emailing to us a signed, scanned copy of a written cancellation letter to cans-cbhi@massmeal.state.ma.us. There is no template for this in the state. There's no official letter that you have to get from CBHI. You just put it on paper, you just write it, scan it, copy and send it. And it can be very, very brief, just saying that this caregiver, you can give the name, cancels consent from this day forward for this child, and put the name on it, and then you can send it to us at this email address. So this is the part that's the new part. So what happens when the caregiver grants consent for multiple providers? Each provider obtains consent as usual. One provider's consent has no effect on whether other providers have consent. That's the family's choice. As before, consent is the whole organization, not for specific clinicians. If one clinician changes consent status, it changes it for the whole organization. I'm going to say that again. This is how CANS consent has worked from the beginning, since November of 2008. So one provider's consent has no effect on whether other providers have consent. As before, consent is for the whole organization, not for specific clinicians within an organization. If one clinician changes consent status, it changes for the whole organization. Continue with when caregiver grants consent from multiple providers. Providers will be able to view and copy CANs across provider organizations with active consent for each provider. And we have labeled that as provider A, B, and C to illustrate that there's multiple providers. When you copy a CANs, the copy becomes yours to edit. Your edits have no effect on the CANs you copied. I'll say that again. So when you copy a CANs from a previous provider, the copy becomes yours to edit. The information that was entered and is contained in the other CANs has no effect on the CANs that you copied. So be sure to enter your correct level of care in your copy before finalizing it, because that could be different. Say you have a child with an existing CANs, an outpatient, and you come in as an inpatient in-home therapist. You want to make sure that when you enter the information and get to the level of care section that you change it from outpatient to in-home therapy. So what happens when the caregiver agrees to consent for provider A organization, but not for provider B organization? Provider A manages consent as yes, but then provider B manages consent as no. Provider A will only see demographic and SED information collected by provider B, since this system will not allow provider B to enter a full CANs in the absence of consent. This basically means that provider A's CANs are not visible to B because they don't have consent. If you would like more information about this, you can find it on the various websites. You can go to the how-to reference guides and tutorials, which are being updated today and will appear by Sunday on the mass.gov site. Excuse me for a minute. The website is www.mass.gov/masshealth/CANs. A shortcut I often recommend to people, if you can't remember these addresses, is just to Google CANs. It will bring you to the mass.gov site, and then you can click and scroll from there to get into the help, getting help with the CANs application, and then get yourself to the reference guides. And when you get to the website, you click on how to use the CANs application on the VG, and that brings you to the reference guides. In addition to that, there's a CANs Family Guide, which is a 3-page document that you can print that explains the what and the why of CANs, including consent. We think this is a really helpful guide to offer to families every time you're beginning to do CANs with them, because it allows them to become oriented to what the CANs is and why we use it. And it also is a good way, we think, for providers to start a conversation. It gives you some language and something the family can also take with them to think about. This CANs consent webinar will be recorded and posted on the CANs training page, and also the training and certification page, and also on the CBHI website. We actually had some technical difficulties posting the current webinar. This is a repeat of the webinar from last week, but we expect by Monday we'll have the webinar up and available for you. On Monday, you're going to be getting an email. Anybody who's a CAN certified user will get an email from the training program saying that these changes have gone into place, and it will also remind you that this webinar is available and posted with the questions and answers on the websites. If in the course of using the new consent process you have any questions, we encourage you to, of course, refer back to this webinar and also the materials that have been sent to you each week in the newsletter and the CANS FAQ and the CANS Family Guide as resources, but you can also call customer service, and your call will be triaged to CBHI for us to provide you with additional assistance. When you call, say that you're calling for help with CANS consent, or just describe what the problem is. That helps us triage the calls. The call number is 1-800-421-0938. That's 800-421-0938. And there's a TTY number for those who need assistance with hearing impairment. The number is 617-847-6578, 617-847-6578. Okay, so now we're switching over to the diagnostic section changes. Joining me shortly will be Jack Simons, who I think a lot of you are familiar with. He's our assistant director, and he will swap off with me at some point soon and be providing some more information here, and of course available during the Q&A section. So the diagnostic section changes. As many of you probably know at this point, the DSM has been changed. There's going to be a new DSM-5 coming out. My understanding is it may be this fall. And as a result of that, the behavioral health conditions that were formerly Access 1 and 2 are no longer going to be part of the CANS. This is due to the changes to the DSM. The remaining sections, the remaining fields for Access 3, 4, and 5 will remain, but they were renamed. I'm sorry, there's a typo on this slide. It says were retained. The remaining fields were retained, but they have new names. How's that? Okay. So the section will also be renamed Diagnostic Factors. So when you go to do a CANS anytime after Sunday, it will no longer say diagnosis, it will say diagnostic factors section. So why were these changes made? As I said, these are in keeping with the changes that are coming to the DSM and the ICD. So it made these changes made it technically difficult to retain diagnoses in the CANS. And actually the CANS is not fundamental. Diagnosis is not fundamental to the CANS. Our focus is on understanding needs and strength. And diagnosis can be communicated in other ways in your assessment. So it's not dependent on the CANS for determining a diagnosis or for billing diagnosis for that matter. So what's different in diagnosis? Access 1 and Access 2 have been discontinued. Access 3 is renamed Physical Conditions. And Access 4 has been renamed Psychosocial Stressors. Access 5 now uses the CGAS as requested by providers. And this occurred because over time we heard from people that they would prefer the CGAS as it provides better rating information for children and adolescents than the current GAF, which we formally reference. But the scale is conceptually unchanged. It's just really adjusted to a better fit for children and youth. Yeah. Okay. We can do. Okay. So right here, what you're going to do is you're going to see a screen that appears on the CANS application. And so currently on the screen, what you notice on the left-hand column there for 3, 4, and 5 is basically it's referred to with Roman numerals 3, 4, and 5. That's how it looks currently. Going forward, you will notice that it's just the name, it's been renamed. So what it does is it captures physical conditions, psychosocial stressors, and then as we mentioned, the CGAS, the Children's Global Assessment Scale. If you need more help with questions related to diagnosis, again, call us at the EHS Customer Service Help Desk at 800-421-0938 or the TTY number for those with hearing impairment, 617-847-6578. Then ask for help with either CANS consent or diagnosis factors. That's really important because it helps make sure that the call is triaged properly and that the operators, if you will, who take these calls, send it to us and it gets to us in a timely fashion. Okay, at this point, we're gonna switch off and we're gonna move into the question and answer period. It's 12:26. We finished a little bit sooner this time than we did last, so we're gonna go for we have up to an hour for question and answers, and we'll open it up at this point. At this point, I'm gonna move it over to Jack Simons, who will assist with the question and answer period. Thank you.
Okay, this is Jack Simons. Good afternoon. Thank you, Deb. Okay, so as you send your questions in, we're able to see them, and sometimes it takes a minute to interpret what we're seeing. We'll answer them the best we can in order. So here's the first question. If the CANS is no longer considered a tool for DSM diagnosis, why is this the first billable unit for assessments? Sorry, thinking about what that means. Okay, I think I got it. So, you know, it is true that in one level of care, specifically in outpatient, you do bill specifically for the initial assessment with the CANS. And that really doesn't have anything to do with the fact that there is a diagnosis included in the CANS or not. There will still be a diagnosis in your assessment, and removing the diagnosis from the CANS really doesn't change the billing situation. If you have questions about billing, please talk to your MCE. Okay, let's move to another one. My company's email does not allow HIPAA compliance to mail identifying information outside of my agency. Is there another way I can send the cancellation letter? That is a great question that just occurred to us yesterday, and we are looking into that, and we'll be posting response. So that's just in the very rare situation where a family member has previously consented, then comes in and says, no, it was a terrible idea, I want to revoke my consent. That's the only situation where you would send a letter to the state. And there is that issue about email that we will look into. Okay, is there a new user's guide with a new CANS format? You're right. There is a printed CANS form. It's not actually what, it's not the user guide. I think it has a different name, but there's a full-length CANS printed form and a bubble sheet version of it if you're doing the CANS on paper, and those will be revised so that the two diagnostic fields that have been dropped will be dropped in those printed versions. If a new CANS release was signed prior to February 22nd, is it still valid? Yes. It's not, you can't operationalize it on the virtual gateway until the go live date, but it doesn't invalidate it if somebody signed it before February 22nd. Okay, what is the pre-populated fax cover sheet? Is it the actual new consent form? No. Really, the situation here is the same as previously, that there is the consent form that you print out and you have the party sign, and then you generate the cover sheet or the fax information sheet out of the application and use that as the cover sheet for the fax. So that really has not changed. How far back does the permission give access to providers with the new permission? Years, or does it start from the 22nd on? So if I understand the question correctly, the answer is the new consent will allow you to see records that were entered by other providers in the past. And if you read the new consent form carefully, you'll see that that is allowed in the consent. So this will be retroactive, and when family members consent to that, they are consenting to CANs that were already existing in the system being visible to people to whom they give consent. Okay, so there have been questions about DCF, and in particular, when DCF is involved with the family, does that change the consent situation? So it's always important with any medical decision making that you know who has the right to make the medical decisions for the child, and in some cases it will be DCF. In some cases the family will be involved in DCF, but DCF will not be the medical decision maker. That will still be the family. So you need to find out what is the case, and if necessary have appropriate documentation if it's not if the child is not in the custody of their family. Whoever has the right to make medical decisions and to consent to release of information has the right to sign the consent form. All right, if we're doing the CANs with a family and they don't feel that there are 2s and 3s, how will this impact us during concurrent authorizations with insurance companies or meeting medical criteria for our programs? So I think there are sort of 2 questions here. One is, how do you work with the family around the CANs? The CANs belongs to you. It's part of your assessment and it reflects your judgment. But your judgment obviously has to be informed by the family's reality. And oftentimes clinicians and families don't see things in exactly the same way, and that's part of the benefit of having a clinician to talk to. But if there are really gross discrepancies between what you want to put in the CANs and what the family needs to put in the CANs, then we think there's important clinical work to be done around that. In the end, you have to put into the tool what you think is correct. One of the important functions of those text fields at the end of each domain is that you can say, this is how I see it, but the family really sees it differently. That way a reader can, a consumer of the CANs will be able to understand that there are multiple perspectives on what's going on. Now then, the question about how that affects authorizations or medical necessity, it feels a little hypothetical. I would say if an issue is coming up as you do concurrent reviews with the MCE, have a conversation about it. about how you determined what would be in the cans. I'm sure they will listen to your interpretation of what's going on. So I don't think there's much more that could be said without specifics. Will the cans change again in the future to accommodate the new DSM-5? No, we don't expect that it will. We think the changes to the diagnostic section will probably stay the way they are. Okay, here's another question about situations where the new consent might have been signed prior to 2/22. My agency's been having the new consent form signed by families since January. Some clinicians have been submitting new consent since then. Do they have to refax these consents again on February 22nd? The answer is yes, and the reason is the new consent form is longer. So our fax server, up until February 22nd, will be looking for a 3-page consent and will not be able to handle the 5-page consent. So if you fax the new consent in prior to February 22nd, it won't register correctly, and it will be necessary to fax it on February 22nd or some subsequent date. Okay, another really good question. I'm just going to read it. I'm curious about what happens to the cans when, if within the same organization, a parent does not consent for cans, say with outpatient, but does with in-home therapy. How does this affect our ability to honor the parent's choice for them to have different preferences within the same agency? So let me first just be really clear that consent, the way it's set up in the new system, as in the old, is by provider agency. It's not by individual clinician, site, or level of care. So your organization may have multiple sites and multiple services, but consent is going to be the same for everybody in your organization. And if it was yes yesterday, and then a clinician working with the family changes it to no tomorrow, it's going to be no for everybody in your organization. So it's important to understand this idea that it's not really consent by service or site or clinician. And if you understand it, then you can have an intelligent discussion with the family about what they're really consenting to. In most cases, you know, our experience so far has been families usually do consent, and we hope that they're doing that in a really informed way. In general, if a family trusts you and other providers to work with them, generally they will also trust you to have information and to see one another's information. But if they don't, if there's somebody within your organization or some level of care or service or site where they don't want them to have consent, then it's going to be true across the organization. And the way to honor that is to say, okay, for our organization, consent will be no, unless and until you change your mind. So I hope that's clear. Okay, if a diagnosis is no longer required, then does the CAN still need to be signed off by an independently licensed clinician? So there's been some discussion with the MCEs about this issue, and I think clarification will come from them in the near future. We can't give you the answer to that today. If a child's in foster care, do we still complete the guardian information on the CANs? How would that look with DCF as the guardian? So I think you're talking about the caregiver domain. And you know, I think really what that domain seeks to capture is information that's going to be useful in treatment about an approach to the child. So if the child is in group care or short-term foster care or something and not returning to a parent, maybe you wouldn't complete that domain and you would just finalize the CANs as incomplete but final, because you really don't have that information about a current caregiver. If a child is in a long-term foster placement or pre-adoptive placement, then that's probably the family support system that you want to be talking about for treatment planning purposes. So I think it's really a matter of you using some judgment on that question. Where do we locate the CGAS scale? I was under the impression the WHODAS was going to be used with DSM-5, and the CGAS is available if you click on the help text indicator in the application. It's a little question mark next to every question. If you click on the question mark, the CGAS will pop up. We're not going to use DSM-5 or any part of it. That's really related primarily to licensing issues. So we are sticking with the CGAS. Next, are 2-year consent expirations still allowed? Yes. You can make the consent for any length of time that the caregiver wishes it to be. Ordinarily, it says 1 year, but you can substitute any amount of time you want in there as long as that's what the family wants. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to read this this whole comment, but basically this is a comment for somebody who has called VG customer support and says has waited a very long time and gotten responses that were not helpful, that there have been delays, delays in making changes to their account, etc. So let me first say we sympathize. We don't control that resource. That's part of the VG. At times there are real delays, especially with enrolling new users. It's our understanding they've been hiring in order to catch up. But if you are getting really frustrated, please feel free to call us. We don't necessarily control what's going on at the VG, but we'll do our best to help you out and to answer your questions. The thing to do first, though, is call the VG and have them initiate a ticket. That makes sure that we can track your complaint. And then ask them to forward you to send the ticket to us, and we will respond at CBHI. Okay, so how are we able to assess parents? I think we're talking about the caregiver domain here. Do we need to get releases of information for their own information shared, mental health, substance abuse, etc.? So again, this is one of those areas where I think there's some judgment involved. Our goal with the CANs is not to capture all the mental health and substance abuse information that might be relevant to a parent's treatment. It's to capture things that will help understand what a child needs. But there is caregiver information that goes into the CANs, and so caregivers should be made aware of that. And then there's always the question of, do you put everything you hear into a medical record? Well, probably not. You use some discretion, and especially around sensitive things that potentially a parent might not want other people to know. So I think it's the response to this has to be one where there's some clinical discussion and discretion, and I would say you err on the side of caution. If a family member is concerned about having something appear in the CANs they feel could be detrimental to them, then you don't want to put it there. The other thing is, you know, this consent form was developed working with Mass Health privacy attorneys. It's their opinion that this consent is appropriate. You can always have additional consent documentation for your own purposes if you wish, but you do have to complete this form in order to manage consent for the state. If people have particular concerns about those things, again, call us. We don't have black and white answers to everything, but we'll have a conversation with you. Yeah, let's do this one. If a clinician uses the assigned consent fact sheet, the one that's generated by the application, but also uses the agency fact sheet, will the consent be received? No, it'll be too long, too many pages. Our system will not know what to make of that. So do not use your agency facts cover sheet. Use only the cover sheet that is generated by the system. Some of our clinicians have historically used the CANS Managed Consent form, that is the cover sheet generated out of the application, but also use the agency fact sheet. Will these be correctly received? Again, the answer is no, and probably all those that were faxed were not correctly received in the past. Do not use your agency fact sheet. Always use the fact sheet which is generated out of the application for that individual. You also can't copy that sheet and, like white it out and write in the name for another kid. You have to generate that sheet out of the CBHI application because it puts not only the name but the Mass Health ID in ways that are machine readable. Okay. A lot of faxing questions. So in this question, the person says, I've heard of some agencies sending all new releases, that is faxing them in on Monday, February 23rd. Is that necessary, or do I just send them in when we would need to typically complete the consent moving forward? Really good question, and the answer is you do not need to do everything on the 23rd or the 22nd, only in time for the CANS. So if you need to submit a CANS on the 23rd, then you should manage consent for that individual on the 23rd. But if they don't need their CANS done for another 60 days, you have 60 days to manage consent and fax in the new sheet. So most of you, there is not a huge rush to do this on a single day. Okay. All right, other people saying they've been using their organization cover sheets, and so let me just reiterate, that's not the way to do it. Use only the sheet that is generated out of the system. Let's see if I've missed anything here. Yeah, this hasn't been asked this time, but it's come up a lot in the past. If a parent declines consent, how should it be documented? So declining consent is different from revoking consent. Declining consent is what we're talking about. You say, do you want to consent? And they say, no, I don't think so. So you manage consent to no, and you make a note in your chart because that's a significant event that you want to record for your own purposes, but you do not send anything to the state. So please don't mail or fax anything to the state in the event that a family declines consent. The way you signify that to us is by managing consent to no in the VG. There is a different procedure, as Deb explained before, for that fairly infrequent situation where somebody has consented previously and then they have a change of heart and they come to you and say, no, we don't want to do it this way, we want you to change it to no. And in that rare situation, there is a provision for you to send something to us.
Jack, the other question that's come up a lot is about faxing multiple consents.
Okay, and apparently a question has come up a lot about faxing multiple consents. So you can do that. You can stack them. in your fax machine, and as long as there's the correct number of pages for each one, our fax server will be able to recognize that those 15 pages in correct sequence are in fact 3 different faxes. So you don't have to dial in 3 times. You can dial in once with, say, 15 or 20 pages. And as long as the pages are correct and you're not using your own organization's consent form, our fax server should be able to handle that. Other questions from the outside? I think we've hit most of them. We're just looking through to see if we've missed anything. So I would like to just reiterate something that I think Deb has already told you, which is these changes that will be in effect on February 22nd are important because we believe the new consent will really allow you to use the cans in a more effective way and save time for you as a provider and save time for the family. We also think it will lead to better collaboration. We think that we will all think more carefully about the information we enter into the cans, knowing that other people are going to be using it. And that's all really good. In most respects, however, this is not a big change. It's really only about other providers being able to see the cans, and only when the family consents to each of those providers being able to do that. In most respects, our procedures haven't changed, and it's really interesting that a lot of the questions actually could have been asked at any point in the last 5 years. I think what seems to be happening is refocusing attention on the cans has reminded people that they have a lot of questions they'd never asked. So we are here and happy to discuss all of those things with you. I'm sorry when we can't give you a black and white answer to some of these questions, but we're doing the best we can. And we owe you some answers on a few of these. One is the question about whether a licensed clinician needs to sign off on paper versions of the cans. So you will be getting a reply on that. Another is the question about scanning and emailing a revocation of consent letter in the rare situation where that happens, because of people are rightly concerned about the security of email, so we will be posting response about that. We're also going to be posting our responses to all these questions from the webinars. That takes a few days in terms of technical stuff, but we will be getting it up for you. Could you give your number again if I need help? So what is, I think we've been giving the VG Help Desk number. 1-800-421-0938. So that'll get you to the help desk. They will register a ticket for you, which means there's a record that you had a question or a complaint. We don't want you to get lost. And then they will either try to resolve the ticket themselves or they will send it over to CBHI. Especially if it's a policy kind of question, they send those over to us. The other thing is you can email us at the CANS mailbox, which will, all this information is in the slides. I will read it off, but it's probably easier to go to the slides. It's mass.gov/masshealth/cans. Pretty simple. Oh, that's the website. Sorry, but there's also a CBHI email, which is also in the slides. And so if you prefer email, you can reach us using the email address in the slides. CBHI number, not VG, please. We're not going to, it's not that we don't want to talk to you, but we really want people to register with the VG when they have a question. Otherwise, we won't have any idea of the volume. We have different people who would respond to you. So we really think we can do a better job for you if you first go to the VG Help Desk number that we've provided. And I know that you don't always get the help that you need there. They don't know the answers to all the questions. They will do their best to be helpful. They will send the tickets to us, especially if you request it, and then we will get back to you. There are a number of us at CBHI who are going to be responding, so we don't want to give you anybody's phone. They might not be in that day. It's different people responding and so on. Oh, the other thing is, whenever you leave a question for us, please describe the problem as completely as possible. A lot of times we feel that we're trying to read your mind. It may be perfectly clear to you what you're trying to say, but a lot of times it's not so clear to us. And the other thing is, there's a lot of documentation, and we would really recommend that you read the documentation, the CANS newsletters and so on. Most of the answers are on the web or in the documentation. Sometimes you really want to talk to a person. We don't mind that. In fact, we really like to talk to you, but you may get a faster answer if you just go on the web and read what's been posted there. So we're going to hang out here for a couple more minutes in case other people want to type in questions. As far as I know, we've answered all the questions that have come in. Right now we have 62 participants. So we have had a lot of people who are interested in these changes, and we appreciate your tuning in to get information. It's 12:56. I think we're going to keep this line open until, for a couple more minutes. If we want you, we could talk with you about the ice dams on everybody's houses. That seems to be the main topic of conversation on all our meetings these days. Well, I'm glad you didn't have to fight the traffic to come to an actual face-to-face meeting. I hope it's been helpful. We look forward to further questions and to working with you to make this a successful transition. Thanks, everybody, for calling in.
Thank you.
And have a good weekend. So they've all been using their